and it looks like we are recording. Hey, hello, welcome to today's painting lesson. Together, we are going to endeavor into a brand new space painting. It's detailed, it's colorful. I think you'll really like it. And of course, as per usual, it will be in real time. In this tutorial, I will walk you through the steps to create large clusters of stars rendered with 3 different techniques while focusing on creating intentional form. And don't worry if you're fairly new to painting, I will explain it in a clear manner while we paint together in real time. That said, let me tell you about some exciting resources up over on the Patreon page, which will help make the drawing and painting process a lot easier. As a patron, you will get access to the traceables for these lessons, which will make it so you don't have to worry about getting your proportions or perspective right by yourself. Additionally, you can find my ebooks covering composition, color palettes, glazing, brushes, as well as just about everything you need to know about acrylic painting. Also, there are over 100 bonus lessons up over on Patreon that you can't find here on YouTube. And you can also get personalized art critiques from me, so you can get feedback on your work while continuing to improve your techniques. There are a lot of great resources up there. I do recommend checking it out. And with that, now we are going to jump into the lesson. It is a long one, it is a fulfilling one, and I think there are a lot of great little lessons within it. So let's relax, enjoy, and stay creative together. We'll begin here today by taking our filbert brush and dipping the bottom third of it into a little bit of water. This is just going to help us keep our paint wet for a longer period of time and condense our bristles. With that, we'll start in the center with a really nice warm hue consisting of our titanium white, about an equal mixture Naples yellow. Now, when we go to apply this, we'll do so in a bit of a rounded application, as if we're following the general movements that we see here. And the idea is just that if brush strokes show through long term, they're working with the painting as a whole. Then we're going to take a little bit of our pink. You can really use any desaturated pink. And I'm going to start working that towards the edge of that first application. Now we'll get a little bit closer, take more of our pink or pale terracotta. We'll interject a little bit of Mars black, not too much, because it's a very strong pigment, and that'll render a nice darker variant, which is important because as we move out from the center, things do need to get a little bit darker, right? Also, we are working with acrylics, so all of our applications here are semi-transparent. At least initially, we'll need to build up our layers to get the actual values and hues that we have on our palette, but that's all right. We are just continuing to work our way out in those circular motions. Grab a bit more water, more Mars black. And you can see just how smooth it is because of the water that is interjected on the brush. Let's make it much darker so that it can kind of fade out into the rest of the background. Just like that. You can see I'm doing a bit of a soft blend into the previous applications. But you can have line work, and that line work, like you can see through here, will actually be really nice long term. It's an added detail, essentially. I will be going back and redrawing all of the added details that we are losing, but drawing it first, even if we do lose it in the painting process, is really beneficial because it helps you essentially figure out what you're doing long term and get familiar with the process early before you commit with paint, right? So the more you draw it, the better you'll get at rendering it long term. Now, before we switch to pigments like our blue or our real purple, which can dilute, the yellow, we're going to go back to that mix go with something a bit more titanium white heavy, because titanium white's incredibly thick as for our pigments, and it'll help us build that initial base layer in an important way. So we'll just build that light now. We're doing it because we don't want to dilute our pigment here with blues, things that can turn this yellow into more of a green. So we just want to handle this first. There we go. Now we'll go into more of that terracotta mix. Still need some of our Naples yellow in there. And you can see that it's a real layering process. We're just slowly building the highlights in the middle, which expand towards the outskirts. And the filbert brush is fantastic because we can use that nice sharp top to it to render these sharp markings, or we can use the rounded edges to create soft blends. And we're doing both. We have line work, but we also have blends from hues into one another, right? Now, as we expand, we're going to need to go back to the darker terracotta mixture that we had, which was predominantly Mars Black and the terracotta, or again, like a desaturated pink. And now for the first time, I'm going to inject some deep violet into it. I'm going to add a hint of titanium white to desaturate it, then a hint more Mars Black to make it darker. We don't want our first applications to be too saturated. And here, you can see this drawing, this sketch with the purple. I'll just start filling that out. You can see the outline right there. The traceable for this will be up over on Patreon, so if you need help with the drawing process, if it looks just a little too ambiguous or nebulous even, you can essentially just work off of that. It should make the process a whole lot easier. Let's make the edges darker, blend it into the background. Whenever I paint on a black canvas, I always get asked the question, can I just buy a black canvas? Because that is something that's commonly sold now at a lot of art shops. And the answer to that is I wouldn't recommend it. That's because we are working with Mars Black, and the black that they treated the canvas with might not be the same black. So it might not blend and mix well if you have open areas. We don't really want open areas towards the end, but I think that with a piece like this, it's easy to happen. And you just cover your bases a little bit better if you paint it with your pigment, because not all black pigments are the same. And we use Mars Black here on the channel because they don't use any animal product. They're typically a cruelty-free pigment, unlike lamp black or a lot of the other common ones. They're kind of made with, as sad as it is, ground animal bones and whatnot. And I never felt comfortable working with that. So that's why we use what we do here. It's also worth noting that if that's something that's important to you, the brush line that you can see here is entirely also cruelty-free. So you don't have to worry about the glues or the bristles or any of that. And that's linked in the video description, and it means you can work with the exact same brushes that I am, so you don't have to worry about not having the same tools. Here I'm starting to interject some line work into that initial purple area. I'm still softening it to a point, and I'm doing that by making the sharp line with the top of the brush, and then I'll use the rounded corners to soften the edges, as you can see. That's why this brush is fantastic for working on these space scenes. It's just very diverse. And we can blend that back down into the center so that it's nice and cohesive, like so. We'll also continue it out down here, continuing from that center point. Really, all of this should have a little bit. And we'll also work our way down here. But I won't go too far down, because I don't want you to not see what we're doing. Here though, again blending the edges out. It's looking fairly messy right now, but that's intended. That's how it's supposed to be at this point. And here we have some additional purple, pink. So I'll just work that middle portion, I'll blend the edges. And the first base layer is typically a softer one, much like this, where it's more opaque and hue filled. Brighter value in the center, and then it dissipates in all directions without any real hard edges. This was just to show you how we're going to begin elaborating on this in the long term. But the starting process is typically a softer one. So, for the sake of being cohesive, we are going to continue mixing about half and half of our pale terracotta and our deep violet, with a little bit of titanium white to desaturate it and some Mars black to darken it, because we will add much brighter variants of this later on. But for a base layer, a little bit darker is definitely ideal, and we can go a little bit darker than that even. So I'm just going to run this up here, following the drawing, again all of the little purple markings, and I think with the traceable this time I will color code it so you know how to and where to instigate these pigments, just because otherwise it'll look fairly abstract, and it'll look fairly abstract anyway, but it's easier to find those distinctions. As for the drawing, I did it with two different mediums. One was a erasable woodless colored pencil, and I did that just because it sticks on a little bit better, so I can retain some drawing through the painting process. And the areas that I want to completely lose and alleviate as I add pigment, I used a Conte, which is essentially just a colored chalk. And with any amount of water that just comes off. And because our brush has water on it in the painting process, it essentially just comes off once you add your first layer of pigment. Now this area is interesting. I'm making the edge a little bit harder, a little bit sharper, and then having it dissipate to the left-hand side. So we're not treating both sides the way that we did over here. This is more of an ambiguous piece, this is more of a structural piece. And with said structure comes a harder edge. As we get down here, we'll just let it be soft. Scraping the brush into the canvas, something I don't normally advise doing, but we're getting this very soft look as I run out of pigment, and it's essentially just a watery brush with a little bit of that purplish pink. Now that we have almost no pigment, we can go up here and do the same. And it's really through these applications of little paint and no detail, just these ambiguous strokes and markings which continue placing movement, that build the painting in a much greater way. Said, it is certainly looking messy right now, and that's okay. Don't let that discourage you. It is just part of the process. And you've seen the thumbnail, you've seen the intro to the video, you know what it turns into, so have faith in the process, have faith in yourself, and we will get there. That said, our pigment in our brush isn't too diluted, so I think I still have the opportunity to just render that center light again. And this is something I'm going to go back to many times just to build it up. There we go. Now we'll turn it into more of that pale terracotta. And expand that way. Now, as we move down towards the bottom, we'll grab, again, equal mixture of these two. A lot of Mars Black, a little bit of titanium white. Maybe interject those hues again, just because there was a lot of Mars Black. When I said a lot, perhaps I should have said a bit, because it is a little overwhelming in the pigment. But we're just going to continue moving a lot of this downwards and creating those larger shapes. So here, we'll have ambiguous edges entirely. So I'll just work the center. I'll work this out as I run out of paint. And now that this has had a little bit of time to dry, we'll just soften it using those rounded edges of the brush. So we have our primary structure, be it a slightly softer one, more opaque in the middle, less on the outside, and then we connect it to everything else through very watery, thin applications. As you can see here. Love that. Then we can do a little bit of a X-shaped pattern towards the outskirts. Just give it a little bit of that hue, value, and visual texture. Then we'll just continue those general movements through individual little pieces. Following that last roll. And I think I'm also going to just make this a bit more connected while we're here. It was done at a different point in time, and it just needed to fit in a little bit better. We're about to be done with the basic structural pieces. That means we can switch our brush, be a little more aggressive with our applications, but we need to build this form first. Now we're just blending edges. So as we step back, I just want to note essentially what our movements are. So we have this one larger one which wraps like this. We have another essentially equally large one that wraps around like this. So it's almost an S, but they don't connect in the middle. And then we have another which protrudes here, which actually gets that connective tissue. And then on the other side, we have one that kind of just moves down. So this one's a bit more unique, but it's essentially going to be a follow through from this. Then we have a couple individual pieces. From there, we'll switch to our larger flat-headed brush, as it can move a lot of paint very easily, and we'll start to fill in the rest of the background. So we'll start by making this brush nice and damp. That condenses the bristles, it'll help thin our paint, and we'll mix a darker variant of that purple, really the darkest that we've had, so just a little bit of the pale terracotta, a little bit of the titanium white. We'll make our mixture really watery, and then we can just kind of start filling in some of this negative space. Might be a little bit too saturated, so I'll just interject some extra titanium white. We'll brighten it a hint, but I think that'll be fine. Maybe not. Trial and error, right? Shouldn't be afraid to try things. Also, the water itself is very reflective, so it's going to look brighter than what the actual pigment is. And that's important to recognize and be aware of, because it can be deceiving as you paint. Here I'm just working my way in the general swirling motion of the painting, working it into our previous markings, but then out into all of the negative space. So as you can see, still yet to look good, but we are making a lot of progress. And in the very least, the canvas is feeling a bit more complete. Still just following that swirling motion. Occasionally I'm interjecting lines by using the sharper edge of the brush. You can see like that. But if I want something softer, then I'll use the full head, and I'll use more of a soft application. So we'll just use a combination of the two. This is to interject structure, but not too much. Now that we have our messy base layer implemented, we can have some fun building out details and highlights. We'll start with our pale terracotta and our purple, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, and we'll just build some of this highlighted pink out from the center, following those same motions that we did with a lot of the Naples yellow, using the sharper edge of the brush to work its way into some details. But as we get towards the edge, as you will soon see, we'll switch to more of the edge of the brush, and we'll get that blend. It's a bit softer, relieving pressure on my brush to achieve it. There we go. And then very softly I'll fill in some of the negative space, which is darker, with very subtle strokes, removing contrast and building highlight. Now we do need to start building up the highlight that's from here. So I'll just create a little funnel effect like that. Naples yellow, terracotta, titanium white, we go. Add more terracotta. Do soft blends with our hands occasionally. Continuing this spiral motion. Just building up the highlight slowly and steadily. We're not doing a lot at any one point. It's baby steps. Good. Now we'll continue transitioning into our purple. You can see how it moves from one color to the next fairly gracefully. Essentially just doing a little glaze in the middle here. Slowly starting to look all right. Just keep being patient, keep working at it, and we will get there. Now I want to start exploring this top area a bit more, and I'll do that with the titanium white, maybe a little bit of our ultramarine blue mixed in with our purple. And of course we will need Mars Black because we can't have it too saturated or too bright, right? This gives us a beautiful purple. That's the most vibrant, unique color yet. Let's brighten it a little bit. Work that along the edge, which will work back down into here, just like so. Let's make it a bit more blue. Blue and bright. There we are. Again, edge. Softly work some of the extra pigment over here so it's nice and cohesive. And now we'll blend it predominantly to the left, not the right. We want this edge to be a bit harder still, as it always has been. Working in some little sharp markings with the top of the brush, but the majority of it is a softer blend outward. There we go. We'll continue with this pigment over here to a point. And we're just working on top of all of our previously incorporated base layers of highlight. Soft blends towards the edge, but with a little bit of a rowdy mark making. You can see that my brush is moving around a great deal. We also need to follow it through here. This is an important part which I will build up over time. I feel like I'm starting to see what it'll look like in the end. Again, you have seen what it looks like in the end. You've seen the thumbnail, the preview, but for me it's still visually coming together a little bit, which is fun. All right, it's exploratory. And yours, especially in a piece like this, will look a bit different. I'm sure it'll look better in a lot of ways. It's an exploratory process for you too, though, all right? We all have all of these subjective opinions about what we like, whether it be softer or sharper blends or more prominent hues, more subtle ones. We're getting there though. Let's go with a heavier blue mix, more titanium white, hint of our purple, a little bit of Mars black. Work that into the heart of this spot. Move it out into the more opaque bodies of applications. A little blending with the finger. Remembering that these two are connected. Just adding another color to diversify and make this more interesting than it once was. Can have hints of it throughout. Just a little tapping in the larger portions of this too. Now, as I step really far back, we get a better perspective of not the little details, but the larger picture. And I think what's notably missing here is a much brighter portion moving like this. So the follow through that brings this and this together, right? So we'll do that with the larger flat-headed brush. We'll grab a little bit of ultramarine blue, about double that in our deep violet, Mars black, titanium white. We're going to start with something a little bit darker than what I think we'll need, and we'll build that highlight as we progress. But yet again, more water because we do want this to be fairly thin. And a lot of the strokes are going to be in this direction, right? We're following the general movements which are already instilled. Now extra titanium white, it's probably too bright. Mars black, a little bit of that ultramarine blue and deep violet. Round two. Using the larger body of the brush to fill in this larger area. and then the sharper head of it to create some line work. Just make it a bit more dynamic. We'll go brighter. But you can see how there's really no rush to get bright. We essentially had 2 practice applications before we got to this hue, which I think is quite nice, actually. Do a soft blend out from it so that it progressively gets darker as you move towards the edge. Might even do that up here. Make it nice and cohesive, right? Expand upon some of the other markings in these general areas. And I've been painting quite slowly for the purpose of teaching, but as you can see, this really is a process that can be done once you're comfortable with it at a much more quick pace. Doesn't have to be though. And that's really what I'm trying to hammer home, right? So we're just building more titanium white in this mixture than any other that we've applied for this spot. Still leaving in that line work, softening as we get down here. I'm going to take a couple of steps back. It's definitely better. It's not there yet though. I think we need more blue. This will soften it to a point. It's okay though, we're not really at our detailed layers yet. We're still building bases. No, we've been doing that for a while, but because it's a bit more visually abstract, figuring out those bases, proportioning, movements, it's a bit more important, and it's best done through the less committal base layers, right? Before we invest all of the time and energy into detail, we want to make sure that we have our foundation right. Oh, that's a beautiful blue. This is predominantly done with the ultramarine blue. We use ultramarine blue here rather than a cerulean or another because it's a bit of a warmer blue and it blends really nicely with purple, which we're using a lot of. Where cerulean will almost desaturate it, take out the hues. This will complement them. Lots of softening. Acrylics do dry a little bit darker than when they're applied, so I am expecting as this dries, this to dissipate a little bit. That's okay. I do plan on just continuing to build it. A little bit more titanium white this time over last. Build these strokes into this a little bit. That way it feels like it fits. And we'll brighten up this spot. Now we can start refining some of our choices, and we'll do so initially by creating a blue with a little bit of the purple mixed in. We want this to be essentially the brightest blue that we've rendered thus far. it would be the brightest pigment, void of what we have there. And I'm mixing up a good amount of it. It can be a little bit messy, in fact. You don't need the entire mixture to be the same thing, and I'm aiming to get slightly different hues throughout. Some slightly more purple, some slightly more blue, maybe some a little bit brighter. But you can see that I'm building up a good amount of it. And I'm trying to spread it out in an open area of my palette. Because, for the first time, we're switching over to our fan brush, and you can tell that it's a stiff bristled fan brush by how sharp those bristles are. I'm not going to wet it because I don't want to condense the bristles, but I will head to my palette, grab a little bit of this pigment, and then in the general direction of our highlights, I'm tapping on detail for the first time. And I'm rotating my brush a lot. I'm not using the entirety of the fan brush. Often I'm just using about a third of it. And we're starting to place in these clusters of light. See that? We don't want to overdo it, so I'm going to move around frequently. As I run out of paint, I work into the less opaque areas. But when I have new paint, that's when we go into the more dense, central, opaque, look at me spots, right? Now, I do need more paint, and we don't mix it with that other brush, we mix it with our larger flathead, because mixing will condense bristles in a way that we do not want to. Still using a little bit of Mars Black in here. Still trying to diversify the color a little bit. And getting an uneven blender mix like this is great. Back to this brush, which is still not damp or wet. Moving out from that central point. We can do these wider taps as I run out of pigment on this brush. And I'm trying to stay in the center when I have that fresh paint. But now, as I run out, we find the edging. For the record, we have a lot of detail work past this. It's not that final stage. So if you're looking at your painting and you're saying, you know what, it still still doesn't look quite right, that's okay. It's not meant to yet. We are still just entering the doorway of details. A little bit of time, and I think we'll all be quite confident. Don't want to work too low there because I can see that it will start cutting off from the camera. So I'll just do some extra taps up here. And at this point, I can tell that the pigment is starting to dry on my brush. Now, we don't love that because we don't want to wet our brush, because if we do, our markings get a lot larger. But if we just let it dry, then our brush will always condense and we ruin our brush. So we're in this spot where I'm essentially just trying to get as much of this paint used, not wasted, as possible. And then I am going to wash this brush, and then I'm going to dry it fully using a painting cloth or paper towel. And then I'm going to come back to mix more of this and continue this process. And it's just about time. Okay, so we are back. Our brush is clean and dry. So I'm jumping back in here with more of that same color, working in the general motions which we've previously instilled. This area really needs to be brightened up as we proceed. So I'm just going to start doing extra taps, building that highlight, but you can't do too many in the same spot while it's all wet, because it will eventually start to condense, blend, and stand out in a way that isn't intended. Now, having this just stand out here looks a little odd. So what we're going to do, once we get the majority of our paint off our brush, is put that down, switch back to the larger flathead, make a bit more of a purple mixture, because that's a pigment that we haven't really done with any bright applications yet. It's more synonymous with the darker hues within the space. So we'll switch to this as we get towards more of the outskirts and the areas that are still as a whole darker, less opaque, more out in the open. Oh, so this isn't the only way we'll be applying stars. We'll be doing it in 2 other ways as well. And again, I'm just using about 1/3 of this brush for these taps, working the purple into the blue. And again, if you would like to work with the exact same brushes I am, you can find a link to where you can buy them in the video description. So there's no guessing. If you have a stiff or a soft bristled fan brush, if your flat-headed brush is the right size or stiffness as well. And I use those brushes for all of these lessons, so if you want to do more of them, you can be very consistent with your tools, like I am. Okay, I think we almost have our base. I'm quite happy with it. So let's get a little bit closer. Now, a reason this looks so incomplete is because it's still, as a whole, very dark. Like, even the highlights right now, dark. So what we'll do is we'll grab a little bit of our ultramarine blue, a little bit more than that of titanium white, smallest hint of our blue. Spread that out well on our palette. Switch back to the fan brush. And we'll start applying that into the now designated almost structural pieces. And we can create little lines and details within these applications, right? So for instance, we have this line of them, but then we have these little details and lines that protrude and come out. We'll skip a little spot, start another line over here, have it expand, soften with our hand. A big part of it is balancing through down here. And this is a bit of a wraparound, so I'm trying to make sure that my taps work in this way. But then they do move downwards, create this little hook. Trying to simplify these abstract shapes into known shapes like hooks and triangles and all of that is a great way of building form confidently. There we go. Starting to get there, right? Yet again, we'll take those steps back. Continue instigating detail, pattern, movement, finding the areas that really balance one another. This bottom area is just so important. Now the next step is going to be fairly dramatic, and we're going to want to wait to let all of this dry. So I'm just going to use up the majority of the paint that I have still on my palette in our mixes. We'll let this dry appropriately. And then we'll come back in probably 20 minutes my time. 2 seconds yours because of the magic of editing. And we'll do a new technique. Essentially, we want to condense a lot of our palettes here, make them a bit more unified, and then we can continue building detail from that. But all of the detail that we've just applied is still essentially a base layer, which is going to have at least 2, maybe 3 more layers of detail stars, all of that. So we'll let this dry, we'll come back to it, and we'll continue having some fun. So I've waited about half an hour just to make sure that it's fully dry. And from there, we're going back to our larger flat-headed brush. We're going to make sure that it's nice and damp. Then we'll grab our pale terracotta, start with about an equal amount of our deep violet, and then we'll add a hint of titanium white. We'll grab more water, thin it out. This point, it's like watercolor. And I'm going to use this to add a highlight and a unifying hue to everything we've applied. Because it's so thin, it shouldn't hinder the value, so how dark or bright it is, to a great degree. The titanium white will make it opaque to a point where it will have an impact, but it won't be a grand impact. And essentially, it's going to flatten the painting to a small degree for us to build more details and highlights on top of it in a more diverse and interesting way. So here, yet again, I'll remix. I'll make it a bit more purple this time though as we get towards the outskirts. Take any legitimate amount of pigment off of our brush. Add more water. Start from the middle. I know my hand's in the way, but I am just trying to work a little bit quickly. And in the process, I do have to forego ideal placement. So here we are, a bit closer, just so you can see what the effects are like from not so far of a distance. See that all of the brush strokes are still in that general direction that we've previously instilled. We can thin paint out even more by just heavily working it and pushing it with the brush. Haven't done too much towards the top. If you watched the last video, you know that I've been a little bit under the weather. And I have a bit of a cough. Currently trying to suppress that. So sorry if I get a little quiet every now and then. Just don't want a louder outburst on here unintentionally, right? There we go. And as it dries, it starts to look a lot better. Everything gets unified. Building up that light towards the middle. Put that brush down for a second. Switching to the filbert. Using this opportunity while everything's wet to rebuild this highlight. Do a soft blend. Move more into the terracotta. Just giving it a bit more form again. So we're going to add a lot of detail on top of that. Okay, and now that it's all visually unified, we are going to stick with that filbert. Mix up a brighter bluish purple, a lot more blue than purple. Titanium white, brightening it. Hint of Mars black to desaturate, but not really to darken. We want this to be brighter. And then with this brush, we can just tap on further highlights And the blue stands out really nicely here. Because we have essentially made everything else more of that pinkish purple hue, right? So now we have a complementing blue rather than one that's just about everywhere. This will take away some detail, that's okay. We're adding more detail on top of it. We're just creating layers. Using my finger for a lot of blending, especially in this part of the process. Taking a step back, getting brighter as it should. Love that. Expanding and softening. A lot of it's semi-transparent, so we're still seeing the tinier applications through these. Very good. Now, we'll switch back to the larger flat-headed brush. Mix up nice brighter purple. Still use some Mars black. And, I believe for the first time, we'll go to our liner brush. Make sure it's nice and damp to condense our bristles. And I'm going to tap on individual details along the lines in which we've previously instated. Some of them are going to be on the outskirts, but the majority of them are in the more condensed areas. And this is essentially how we're softening that harder edge that we previously intentionally put here. I'll get you a bit closer for this application though. So, up close, it's really not all that complicated. We're essentially doing what we were doing with the fan brush earlier, but with a greater degree of control and a slightly larger marking. Because of the fan brush, we were pressing in with individual bristles, where here, while it's a small brush, it's still a collection of bristles. And we're just trying to heighten some of these defined forms. This is always something we can go back and do more of though, so we don't want to overdo it. And we do want to just splash in a couple throughout. That way it still feels natural within the larger areas. Right? Here I'm using intentionally linear patterns. That said, still plenty to be done. And I think it's time to apply the stars in the most traditional way. So from here, we're grabbing our larger flat-headed brush, some of our ultramarine blue, about half that, maybe a little bit less, maybe a third, in our purple, titanium white, hint of Mars black. This doesn't need to be extremely bright for the first application. Then we will grab our liner brush, make sure it's very wet, we'll thin out our pigment to, again, the point where it's like watercolor. I'm going to put my palette down and hold my brush on an angle in which I want to deliver paint, peel back the bristles, and just launch paint, splatter paint on the canvas. Because it's a darker hue, you won't really see it to a great degree. We're just applying subtly initially. You will notice that that area is getting covered. That's okay. Part of the process. We are going to go back in and fix that. That said, now pick up our palette, make a brighter mixture. I think I still want it to be blue heavy. Hint of the purple though. Take our brush, and because my hand is getting covered in paint, I'm going to essentially just leave my palette down on the easel while I'm doing this, but I'm not mixing any different colors. We're just using what we've already established. I know that through this, I will occasionally move in front of the canvas as I apply it. I do apologize. It really is just one of those things that requires certain angles, and the camera is sometimes in the way of said angles. But this is the most, I would say, traditional way of adding stars. I think this is the way most of us have done it for a long period of time. Make sure that you have a drop cloth put down, because you can splatter the background of your workspace. Definitely getting better. We're just building layer by layer. Don't love this application, so I'm going to make my brush really wet and essentially just take that off. Back to the palette, even brighter. If you hear sirens, that is not on your end, that is on mine. Still building those layers. This is why we went in with a darker pigment initially. We knew that we were going to get to something that was much more layered. Sometimes when you work very much on a hard angle, you can develop these lines, which you don't really want. So I'm just using the liner brush and a lot of water to move that about. Starting to get there, isn't it? Again, I know I'm in the way. I do apologize. Now we'll go with an even brighter variant. And we'll use this exclusively towards the center. That is not towards the center. Just clean that up quickly. There we go. Still plenty to do, but very happy. Let's just actually grab some of this. And still some larger shapes and movements. You can also do this through essentially pointillism, where you just tap on all of those stars. Or you can do a combination of the two. This will really build our highlights. It was a very dark painting for a long time. This is where that light can really have an opportunity to come out. We'll get a little bit closer together down here, just so I can further show you the techniques, but with a bit more detail. So I'm starting with these lines, which are instigating form. And now we'll switch into taps. There we go. Getting a lot of notifications on my phone. Apologies if you can hear that. I just have the reference photo pulled up. And I'm building up the highlights, particularly in this central area, to the point where we're almost losing detail, but that's okay. We're just creating a new form, and we can always go back and re-interject that detail through a brighter hue, brighter value, as we progress. You will notice, though, through the addition of the stars that we just applied, we will lose form, and it's up to us now here to re-instigate the areas that we felt really defined the painting. So that typically means going back to the areas that were once the most opaque. Now, as we step back, I think the larger issue with it now is that we have so much highlight on the edges that the initially brightest area is now one of the darker areas. It has bright colors in it, but the values of them aren't as bright as what we have around. So it's now our job to recreate that central bright spot and make it brighter than the rest of the painting. Now we have a bright base, so we have a good place to work from. We start with the Naples yellow and titanium white. We interject more of that terracotta. I'm using the filbert brush because it has that nice rounded edge for blending. This will still likely take a couple of layers, and that's okay. Now we'll go a bit heavier on the terracotta and use a hint of our purple as we continue to work our way outwards. I have almost no pigment left on my brush, so I'm just doing a warmer, watery application. Just like so. Going over a lot of the stars, it's okay, we can always paint more, but likely this will be semi-transparent to the point where it won't matter. We'll still see the stars underneath. Have some follow through with the surrounding areas. And just like that, it's looking a whole lot brighter. Now we'll switch back to our liner brush, grab some of our deep violet, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black. And we'll tap in some larger stars with it. We have a lot of blue still, or at least bluish purple, which doesn't look like that which we are currently applying. This is definitely a heightened version of anything we have on our palette and our canvas. There we go. Lots of sounds outside today. So I'm trying to diversify my placements. There we go. Now we'll make a brighter variant of it, extra titanium white. And with this one, we're actually going to go into the hearts of what we just applied and brighten them further. So it looks like that first application is a bit of a glow, and the second application is the actual light itself. This will make them all stand out to a much greater degree. You don't have to get all of them. I know that there's a lot of markings on the canvas. It's easy to feel like some portions get lost, but this will really bring up the ones that you do find and want to further pronounce, right? So we're just also creating clusters sometimes. So as individual ones, we don't want to space them all out evenly. We don't want an area to be too void of them. Just want it to look natural as best we can. And I think having quite a few in this vicinity to brighten up this area, give it a bit more of an interesting follow through and body, is a good way of progressing forward. So I'm going to spend some extra time just in here and get more blue as we move up. There we go. Now, after all of that glazing, we will likely have to reinstigate more of the fan brush taps. So I'll just mix up a medium to bright bluish green, something very much in between the two, like that. We'll switch over to our fan brush, pick up that pigment, and then because everything was softened, we'll just reinstigate detail down here. Here I'm doing a bit of a wider pitter-patter to just fill in some of that darker negative space with pattern. I'm not looking to get any real line work in here. We're just, well, here we can get some line work. That's part of our pre-existing body of stars, right? Jumping around so that I don't do too much in any one area. Now, as you can see, I let everything dry and then I went back in with a Conte to draw in a lot of the detail work which you saw in the initial sketch. Now, if you're up on Patreon, if you're using the traceable, this will be drawn in a bit of a bronzish red, so you know how to apply it here now after everything else. But we're going to mix the color with our larger flat-headed brush, and for the first time, we'll grab some burnt sienna. We'll mix it with about a third of that in our deep violet. We want to desaturate it fairly well. So Mars black, titanium white, we'll start with an equal amount of the two of them. And I think this actually needs to be a little bit more saturated and B, a little bit darker. So we'll go back in with the red, with the sienna, with the purple, and a little bit with the Mars black, but I do mean a little bit. So mix that up. Grab our liner brush for application. Make sure it's nice and damp. Grab our pigment. And we'll head in towards the center of the light. And I can tell that I want this portion to actually be a bit brighter. So I'll get you closer and we'll work on the refinement. So as you can see, first marking quite dark. Let's add a little bit of titanium white to our mixture. Put that back, grab the liner, make sure it's nice and damp. We remove that darker pigment. And here, I'll go back in over where I did my drawing. This is so much better. Perfect. Glad we didn't just continue. And we worked until it was cracked. So this is going to have a lot of these markings work their way out in a rounded movement. We're working with very watery pigment, intentionally so. That way we get a sharp, fine marking. Also so it's semi-transparent and the light can work its way through it. Just like that. That said, we are going to want to clean up the areas of the Conte that don't end up getting paint, though we have to wait until this dries to do so, otherwise we'll really move around the paint that we are meticulously applying. And now, I think we're getting to a place where I do want to darken it yet again. We move out from that center. And we will refine that center with brighter hues a little bit later on, but for now, happy with it. It's what we need to progress. Mars black, titanium white, making it a bit more red, a bit more purple, a bit more red, but not too saturated. Give that a go. It's starting to get darker in the room. Sun is setting. Been at this for a while so far. So here you can see that we're just bringing it back into those previous markings. When I want the application to be larger, I apply more pressure with my brush. And smaller, less pressure. A lot of these connect, but not all of them do. It's also worth noting, we talked about the traceable. If you're new to the channel and you are unaware, you can find the Patreon link in the video description, where you can find the traceable reference photo, so you can help yourself with the drawing process. Either transfer it via mini projector or tracing paper, or just freehand sketch it with the gridded version of the traceable. It's something I like to do. And the reference photo is, of course, something you can print out and test your colors directly on it if you find color matchings tricky. Up there you can also get critiques by me. I record them. So people send in their images of their paintings and give it a good look. Talk about what works, what we can work on. Friendly little chat about art, right? You can also find all of the ebooks that I've done, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Teaches you everything you need to know about glazing, different color palettes, what brushes to use, how much water to work with, all of that good stuff. There are also ebooks full of other traceables for days where you want to create something, but you're not sure what that is yet. We have a lot of landscapes, but there's also one with flowers. And there are also over 100 bonus painting lessons that aren't here up on YouTube. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody likes to share their artwork, their renditions, so you can get ideas on how you can work on and improve your pieces, but also interject pieces of yourself. And it's just a really friendly community where everybody likes to pitch into the conversation and help. To everybody up there, incredibly proud of you, always. Love seeing the work, but also, even to a greater degree, love seeing the friendly support and community interaction. Occasionally I'll post a little polls up there of, here are 3 different paintings, which one would you like me to, or 3 different reference photos, which one would you like me to paint? We just did that. The waterfall I posted 2 weeks ago ended up winning. The lightning that I posted came in second, so we did that one as well. But a lot of good things up there. So check it out if you're interested. Link in the description. We can also find the brush set and all of that good stuff. This is coming along really nicely. I think we should probably take a step back and just make sure that we're balancing it well, though. Stepping back, I do like it, but I feel like it's easy to overdo, and I might even simplify portions here, though I do want to solidify what we have up in this area, because we need to make it cohesive with the rest of the piece. It means we need to interject it in other areas of the painting and not just so centralized. So I do have the drawing for this on here. We'll just work this through. A lot of it kind of trails this movement, which makes it easy to project. We also have more down here, and it'll stand out over the brighter areas better than it will the dark ones, simply because it is quite dark itself, and it won't have a lot of contrast in those spaces, though we still need to incorporate it there because the hue will be different. So there will be a subtle variance for the eye in the very least. Grabbing more, you have a long line over here. It's worth noting that I'm not always also making lines. Sometimes it's just a little tap, and sometimes those taps connect. Do you like the larger markings to be done in larger areas? So portions where it's had time to elongate, space to elongate. The little taps are generally much sharper and smaller. Really love it down here and up there. I think that it excels as a supplementary piece, not something that's too dramatic. And now that we have experimented with it in other places, I definitely want to soften that, which is something I was thinking about, but it's now definitely a solidified plan. That just goes to show that we can go into these paintings with a lot of planning, and I very much do. Often I find I spend more time actually planning the lessons than I do doing the paintings. But it's important to recognize that the painting and everything will adapt along the way. So we adapt with it, right? If it isn't perfect the first time, it isn't reason to stop it entirely. It's reason to adjust. Look at where it didn't work. Ask yourself, how can we remedy it, better it in the future, and then proceed to do so, right? We don't quit on things when they get a little hard, or when they aren't that perfect vision of what we expected them to be. We persevere, and we continue working to build that magic, because it's there. We just have to put in the effort, right? Okay. Starting to like it a lot. All right, now for the next step, we need to make sure that our canvas is entirely dry. We're going to switch to our filbert brush, grab some titanium white, a little bit of our pale terracotta, and I do mean a little bit. We definitely want it to be more titanium white heavy. We'll also grab a hint of our Naples yellow, again doubling down on the titanium white. We'll make it very thin, so grabbing lots of water on my brush, heading into the center oval. I'm going to start blending out from that middle portion. As you can see, it's flattening a lot of the values within the space. The rounded edges of the filbert are giving me a soft blend. And it's making all of those darker portions in the center feel much more natural. Right now we have a gradient where it's subtle in the middle, and then it slowly progresses to get darker, more stark as we get towards the edges. You can see that I'm moving my brush in that general oval shape. Let's go for a more thick pigment. Mixture between the three. There we go. Softening, lots of softening. Like that. Love that look. Now, we had a lot of these kind of take over those brighter areas towards the edges, and because this middle portion is now just so bright and full of light, we have the opportunity to go back and brighten up, add to the stars along the edges. So, once I stop impulsively painting, we can do just that. So we'll start up towards the top left-hand side with our larger flat-headed brush. We'll mix a little bit of our deep violet in with a good amount of our ultramarine blue. We can see the greater highlights that we've rendered in the past just here on the palette still. We're looking for something similar, though we can build it up. So I'm not going to go quite as bright as what we have. I'm just going to go slightly underneath. We'll switch to our fan brush, grab a little bit of paint on either side, and you can work this either in between those areas, or you can go off and start rendering all new portions, right? Now I feel like a lot of these feel very linear, which is the same with those markings, right? So what I want to do here is actually just start to consolidate a little bit. That way it's not all a collection of larger lines, but some larger bodies as well. So we'll just pick a couple areas to kind of thicken. And already I can tell I want to go brighter and lean into the blues. So, titanium white, ultramarine blue. Beautiful. Remember, these mixes don't have to be perfect. So if we have a little bit of blue, a little bit more white, it's not a bad thing. It'll just interject added diversity in a nice way. Just using about a third of the brush. And I'm using it sparingly. It's not going everywhere. Maybe just a hint of it over here. Bringing it down into that light. Building up this larger structural piece. When I have very little paint, we can just do our little taps. Continue to build form in however we like. Then I think I'll move a bit down in the canvas. Now that we're a little bit lower, remember we want to focus on driving this line through. That means really building on this area, which is a bit of a confluence of that and this. Bring a little bit of that inwards. As I run out of paint, then we start to work on the general movements to a greater degree. Kind of taper off that brightness. And now, because that's so bright, we definitely need to work it over into the edges so that they still feel natural within the setting. Because at this point they feel rather dark. Not because they are dark, but just because of the relation to that central piece. So we'll just fill this out. There we go. We can soften some of the areas through the magic of finger painting, should we want to. Now, stepping back, I really like where it's at. I really feel like we've been able to consolidate pieces and soften where we need to and heighten where we need to, and that's what a lot of this is. But we have this warm hue in the middle exclusively, and I want to bring it out a little bit just to balance the painting a little bit better. So we're going to take our Naples yellow titanium white, little bit of that pale terracotta, switch over to our liner brush, and now we'll just find a couple places in the painting for perhaps something similar to this in the far, far distance, right? And I'm just starting with little taps. We can soften them if we want with our finger, or blend them with our brush, and then I like to go back in and just do another little tap in the center. That way it looks like they have a glow. So we'll make our marking, we'll let it dry for just a second, really not too long. Use our finger to soften, and then we go in with the
application yet again. There we are. Very subtle, but I like it. Now, heading back to refining some of the highlights. I'm going to use a liner brush to mix just because we don't need much pigment here. And I think this will do just fine. But we are nearing the end, and if you've watched the channel before, you know that towards the end of these, I like to give you a little keyword, a little code word you can use in the comment section to know that you are one of the, on average, 13% who makes it to the end of these very long lessons. And if you are one, I'd like to say congratulations to you for being one of those dedicated few who are really invested in learning and getting better at art in general. But with that, I think one second. I'm going to take a couple of steps back. I just want to look at. We have a much brighter area right here. We have a much brighter area right here. We're starting to create those clusters in the way that I really wanted to. I'm going to try to continue facilitating that idea. Adding 2 right there. Good. Let's balance it. You have a lot of bright happening. It might be too stark, so I'm going to try to just build outwards a little bit. Good. I think for today's keyword, I don't actually want a word. I want your favorite film or novel or poem about space. Just let me know in the comments that which really inspires you about settings like these. For me, space in general, the future, sci-fi, really love the Blade Runner series. Something my father really appreciated, and it was just one of those things that I guess was passed on because they're both the final cut and the new one by Denis Villeneuve are just films I could watch endlessly. And the quote at the end about memories being lost like tears in the rain, just, oh, it gets me every time. I think a lot of people really tend to like Interstellar. I think that's a popular one. You can also talk about other sci-fi that doesn't necessarily pertain to space. I was watching Her the other day. Joaquin Phoenix. That's a fantastic film. Especially in the grand advent of AI, right? So I would love to know that which inspires you so that I too can jump in and enjoy it. And space is just so interesting. We had a film just a couple of years ago about Brad Pitt. And he goes out to find his father in space. He was a legendary astronaut. That was great. The Martian, great. A lot of brilliant films. Arrival, adore Arrival. Again, you don't actually get to see space in it, but great sci-fi story. And I think that Denis Villeneuve really just can't do wrong when it comes to filmmaking, to be honest. Incredible mind. Again, would like to say a big thank you to everybody supporting the channel up over on Patreon. Say it all the time, but really couldn't make these lessons, spend the time on them that I do, the planning, if it wasn't for you and your support. So big thank you for making lessons like this happen. This channel is predominantly community funded up there, and just really appreciate it. So thank you. Again, the traceable for this will be color coded. You can find that in the video description, along with a brush set. For the record, these are still the same brushes that I started using right after we made them. So they're proving to have the longevity I hoped for. If you take care of them, they should last. Right now I'm just trying to figure out balancing of light. And that's really it. Trying to fill out the negative space with these necessary taps, making them a bit larger. I'm applying extra pressure with my hand to do so, but then I'll also do tiny ones in void areas that just don't have any detail, but I don't want to brighten them up. So we're just adding essentially a texture or a rhythmic application while not committing to drawing the eye in that area. And for that, you could also go with a less bright variant, but really like what we're accomplishing here, and now we can build out some of these other highlights with it. Tapping in to the swirled effect. I feel like we could use some connective tissue between here. You can see that I'm holding my brush from quite far away at this point. That way I can see the painting as a whole. This area is brighter, but it doesn't really have any stars, so I'll interject some in here. Not too many, but enough. Anyway, I think this just about concludes our painting. So I'd like to say a big thank you to you for spending this time here with me. I know that these are longer lessons, and I love, appreciate, and respect your dedication to the process, learning, and traditional art, because I think it's lovely, and I love that we're keeping it going, making it special. So thank you for being here. I hope you have a great time. I hope you feel inspired. I can't wait to hear about all of your favorite space and sci-fi media. And again, all of the resources, the types of paints, colors, all of that listed in the video description. I'll see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. And above all, as always, stay creative.